and Joe Madden, who's with EOS Climate, which is a really innovative startup working out of the Valley focused on climate and climate finance. So thanks for joining us, guys. Great to have you here.
Thank you.
These city tracks are really designed to give some insight into local markets around the world and what's happening on the innovation front. So GetGlobal is looking at these big kind of national super session discussions, Japan, China, here in the United States. But a lot of action is actually happening in these hubs, in these cities. And Silicon Valley has really become the hub for technical innovation. So today we're going to be talking about this subject, and I think we'll kick off with you, Mr. Madden, and tell us a little bit about what you guys are doing to approach the subject of climate change from a Silicon Valley lens.
Okay, so what our background originally was in climate change and market mechanisms to address climate change. And so California has a cap and trade system, and we developed a business that sort of plugged into that marketplace. What we didn't realize a few years ago when we started was that our approach really was novel in the sort of carbon emission reduction space. And so we had to sort of redesign what existed in carbon finance mechanisms to really take a sort of production model approach. And the learnings out of that actually started to look a lot like commodity markets and how commodities trade. And so we realized that what we had done may apply in a global context in the commodity trade, but there were sort of two things that were missing. One is there was not sufficient technology at the time to sort of reach the scale that you needed to have. And the second thing was there wasn't really a demand driver outside of some sort of policy-driven or regulatory environment. And then two things happened simultaneously. One was blockchain technology sort of came into the mainstream, which really is a quantum leap on what currently exists in environmental commodity registration. And the second thing that happened was carbon risk sort of hit the demand radar in capital markets, starting with sort of stranded assets. And so then we started thinking about if you could actually attach information and associate information with each unit of commodity production so that it represented the environmental and social impacts, you could actually deliver that information to the global marketplace. And so that's what we're in the process of building now. And the idea is ultimately to price externalities in existing global markets. So really using risk as a driver.
Okay, great. And Grant, over at Goodwin Procter, you're seeing a lot of these companies come through who are working on disrupting a variety of areas. Tell us how that's working out for Goodwin Procter and what you guys do to assist those companies trying to disrupt.
So we like to take companies basically from the infancy of the idea all the way through their exit, whatever their exit strategy is. And part of what we do is provide a lot of the expertise. Silicon Valley in particular is really set up as an infrastructure that I think allows these technology companies to take off, and that's why you see a lot of the disruption, and the legal aspect is part of that. So some of the things that we're seeing, like for example, some of our clients, is I think we're seeing them change technology, or change or disrupt in two different ways. One is taking existing ideas and kind of flipping them on their head, sort of like the Uber concept, taking the taxi cab and changing transportation. But we're seeing it some interesting ways. So some of it's very simple and basic, such as dog vacay, where they are actually taking, allowing people to have, everybody have house sitters. So for dogs and other pets to come in, if you're leaving, you can go, basically, they'll take your dog for the week and use it. And that's using Airbnb concepts and applying it to different areas. You're also seeing it in the context of this really interesting company that is using arbitrage and technology to make stamps cheaper for everybody. And they're using digital currency to facilitate some of those transactions. Those are kind of some of the more traditional type things, but there's some really interesting ideas. You also are seeing just the revolutionary changes, I think, so they're really disrupting. Joe mentioned blockchain, so we're seeing a lot of interest in blockchain technology. Companies such as Tyrion, for example, who are making applications to current industries, but really changing it. Ripple also is another company that we're seeing, where they just recently announced 12 banks, nationally well-known banks, who are using their exchange to transfer money in a much more economical way. And I think those are the types of things that we're seeing. And it's really, and as well as artificial intelligence, we're seeing there's definitely a lot of interest in that area as well.
Right. So for both of you, what are the leading trends coming out? Are there any sort of threads that are flowing through all these various different companies that you think are common? Is there something that's unique to Silicon Valley that it's bringing out all these types of companies?
So I think one of the trends I'm seeing is the democratization of things. And what I mean by that, and you've seen that a lot, you're seeing it now in finance for sure, but you're seeing this concept of we want to make the world a better place and we want everybody to participate in it. And so whether it is through everybody with a phone can bank, or whether it's everybody can be their own VC through a crowdfunding mechanism or something like that, it's people trying to impact the world, and the world has expanded beyond the U.S. borders. And this is a big change, I think, in the last 5 to 7 years, where they're trying to hit every single market and underdeveloped market, and trying to apply technology to make the world a better place and make money doing it.
Right. So, Joe, what's it like to be an entrepreneur in Silicon Valley today? It's sort of this, you even have an HBO show about it, right? But what's it actually really like being in Silicon Valley and trying to get a company off the ground?
So I have to say that there are some funny moments in that show that actually are not that far from reality. But it's a fantastic place to be. I think you have to be an entrepreneur, you have to have almost, you almost have to be perpetually naive. Sort of foolish enough to keep thinking that something can go forward. But I was talking with Grant prior, and I think there's a cultural understanding within Silicon Valley that things are, number one, possible. And it's not just entrepreneurs that think they're possible. Actually, attorneys think they're possible. People that are supposed to tell you that's not what you're supposed to do will allow you to step over and say, well, this is the risk, but go ahead, I'm advising you about the risk, but go ahead and take the risk. And I think there's a understanding that permeates all the things from the finance, the VC community to the legal community, and even the actual folks that are joining the organizations. People don't really say, who do you work for, or they ask what you're doing now. So I think it's a really fascinating place to be, and I think it's a great place to be. It's a little frustrating sometimes, but I don't know where else you can go and do this type of work.
So you mind if I just
Please,
add?
yeah.
Yeah. So what I would echo Joe's comments. I would also say the culture is such that there's a tendency to let's do it and we'll ask for forgiveness later. And the sense is if this idea is good and we're going to run with it and it succeeds, the law will evolve around it and essentially allow it to happen.
Well, you've certainly seen that with Uber, right?
So Uber's a great example. I mean, I think we often get clients who come in and say, I want to adopt the Uber model, which is maybe we'll break a bunch of laws, but it'll all work out fine. And I'm not saying whether they're breaking laws or not, but I think it depends. So some of the risks are greater than others. When you're dealing with state commissioners, that's very different than when you're dealing with the SEC or the DOJ. So part of what we do is try to advise them where are the bigger risks and less risks. But people are really willing to take risks. And what you learn is you don't say no, you just say here's those risks, and you try and modify them. The other thing I think that you see in Silicon Valley, which is really unique, is failure is okay. And most entrepreneurs know that they're going to fail at some point, but that's okay. They've learned a lot, and failure can be a small thing such as this particular business plan didn't work, so we'll pivot and move, or it can be the company. But it doesn't dissuade them from doing it again, and it doesn't dissuade, our firm, for example, and Silicon Valley firms from investing their time and efforts into companies that fail. Likewise, VCs, et cetera, they know that's part of the process. And that part of the culture, I think, is fairly unique to Silicon Valley and is one of the things that allows it to thrive.
Yeah. So for both of you, one of the kind of mantras of Silicon Valley is that you need to scale, and that you need a kind of concentration of activity of whatever it is. It could be capital, it could be talent, but it is some concentration of these things that enable the scaling to happen. So can you sort of relate to us how Silicon Valley is providing that? Like what makes it Silicon Valley unique as a place to actually make that idea a reality?
So I think I can take that from experience of having no real understanding whatsoever about starting a business or anything along those lines. And several years ago, I started working with an entrepreneur who had an idea that you could drive efficiency in tractor-trailer transportation. And within, I don't know, a couple of weeks, we had met with top-tier attorneys. That everybody was willing to listen to us. And quickly, you can then get to top-tier finance folks and all of the other connections that you need to make. Oh, I know folks in manufacturing. And there's an ecosystem that's so extensive. So things can happen very quickly. And the understanding is that things need to move fast and they need to get to scale. That I would say that's also embedded in the overall understanding.
Yeah, I think that last point is really important, is that it's funny, when I ask clients who come in and say, are you making money? Almost invariably say, we're not focused on making money. In fact, that's going to inhibit us from growing. If we're focused on whether we're profitable or not, that's a problem. I have had clients who have said, we're not trying to partner with anybody because we think it will slow us down. So even though we have CBS or somebody who wants to come in and partner with us, that slows us down. So we want to just grow market share, and everything else will take care of itself. And I think that mindset plus the VC's mindset that that's a good thing versus VC, if you had investors who said we want to start making money from day one and that's what we're mostly focused on, very hard to scale in that way. And so I think that mindset allows that scalability.
And is it also true that perhaps it's a little bit easier to actually go about it yourself without partners, because so many of the things that make a business are now easily either outsourced or kind of commoditized? Would you agree with that? And does it make it easier? You think about like the big success stories, whether it's a Warby Parker or any of these other companies where traditionally you'd have to go through a complete supply chain for both the production side and the distribution side. Now it seems like a company can say, we're going to do all this ourselves and get it to market via an internet outlet. Does that give Silicon Valley an advantage because these companies just need to be in the right place and have the right connections, or is it still more to it?
I think there's more to it, but I think that's very true. It is easy. I mean, you can launch a company by putting an app on Google App, and it takes off, and now you've built this big company, and then you kind of figure out what to do with it afterwards, but you got this popular app. So I think that there's a lot of that allows you to do a lot of things. I also think the technology. So what's really interesting is many of our companies' engineers are not here in Silicon Valley. They're all over the world because it's cheaper to to retain certain talent. Also, you have a lot more consultants now than you used to. And because of the infrastructure that is now there with the internet, et cetera, it allows people to combine all these pieces without having to buy each component of it. And I think Silicon Valley is not unique in that way, but I think, again, that mindset and that ability and the connections and having people connect certain industries together is fairly unique to Silicon Valley.
Yeah, and I would add to that on some levels. The strategics are actually starting to be more innovative. So large-scale, existing global entities are realizing that the pace of change is not something that they can actually keep up with. So you can see them starting to plug in and associate with Silicon Valley. And so their presence, they don't necessarily want to own the companies, but they do associate. And they're starting to provide resources which allow for scalability because they're already well placed. But I think the pressure for them to transform their businesses beyond what they're capable of doing internally. So you can see them starting to, you see a lot of different folks setting up in the Valley to have a presence there.
But no place is perfect. So what are the weaknesses in Silicon Valley? Like when you compare it to other big hubs like New York or London or Shanghai or Hong Kong, everybody has some competitive advantage in one way or another. But what are the weaknesses in Silicon Valley that maybe make it a little bit harder to actually complete a disruption or a scale or an innovation?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think so some of the advantages that I mentioned, for example, the desire to just break the rules and figure it out later, I think that can impede companies because I've represented some where they have built a product, they've built a business, and it did not comply with regulations, and particularly federal regulations, and so they've gotten shut down. And so I think in other markets there'd be a greater sensitivity to that and an awareness of it, and so I think that can happen in Silicon Valley, whereas you probably would not have that happen as much on like Wall Street, for example, or London.
Yeah, and I would say that so the world that we've sort of existed in is this global climate and sort of natural resource constraints world. And what I see in Silicon Valley as a limitation is there's such a focus on technology with almost no regard for large social institutions or national frameworks. The idea is that you can start with a piece of technology and just blow it up. Whereas that might not work with tax infrastructure, that might not work with different markets. And so I think the perspective is so focused on the technology that some of the other context is lost. And I think it's a significant challenge for Silicon Valley. I had a meeting with an investment VC about 2 months ago, and it was a casual meeting, and he said, "What is that Paris thing?" Right? We was talking about the Paris Agreement and climate. It's a pretty significant thing. What is that thing? I think that was emblematic of some of the thinking there. Oh, these things that go on other places, we know better, and we can fix it with technology.
It's really great. I'd love to take a couple minutes if anybody out here has a question or a comment on this. Two great thinkers from the Valley here. Anybody want to ask anything?
What do you think is realistic about this show Silicon Valley? Because I've heard that too from people from Valley saying it's eerily similar sometimes.
Well, so there's almost like hero worship of certain VC players or certain different CEO players, and kind of it's like an inner cultural community that's what folks understand, and that's who they're following, and that's all who matters. Like other folks may follow sports figures or something like that, and so and some of the stuff is so ridiculous, right? Somebody just got like, hey, they just got $70 million, and you're like, for what? And like you go through what they're actually doing, and then also like literally at a coffee shop in San Francisco, you can sit down, and if you sit there long enough, there'll be someone come up and you can overhear their conversation about what they're actually going to do and why it's going to be the next Uber, or and they're ridiculous, but they totally believe it. So I think that that in the show you can see that.
Please.
In thinking about accessing more traditional forms of capital, like bank financing, what have you, I guess, seen as some of the things that some of the early banking partners do well in terms of understanding the nature of the companies, the pre-profitability, the lack of, profitable, resources?
Sure, I think there's certain banks that do it very well. Silicon Valley Bank is one who does it very well. I think they understand the risks involved. They understand, ideally a bank would have 17 different forms filled out, due diligence, et cetera. I think the banks that do it well understand you're not going to have that kind of infrastructure. You're not going to have that kind of security. I think also speed. How quickly, if it takes them 6 months to close a loan for a startup company in Silicon Valley, that's half a lifetime, so that doesn't work. And then the other thing where I think there's a big difference is fostering that company. So we were talking about this before too. One of the reasons VCs, I think in some ways work better than a crowdfunding type product, although I think crowdfunding is great, is if a bank comes in, not only do they put the money in, but then the bank is in, a successful bank will then invest in that company all throughout its stages. So they will hold seminars where, you know, people like myself will come in and talk about whether it's HR issues or employee compensation issues or things like that, other industries that these people can use, so that they are a constant resource for that company, so that that company grows with them versus just being a pure cash source. And I think that actually is of tremendous value and is a big differentiator.
And I would agree with that. So if you look at Silicon Valley Bank, they look at the company as an asset, not just an ongoing customer. Like they take it on almost as an asset. And so I think that is different than the traditional sort of banking perspective, where there's a security and there's a transactional nature. And so the company itself and the organization being an asset, I think, is a different perspective.
That's great. You know, a lot of people feel like the future is being built in Silicon Valley, and there are a lot of concerns, like every day, I think bigger and more relevant concerns about the technology that's coming out of the Valley and what kind of impact that will have. And so, you know, this year has really been about AI and talking about what the impacts, the human impacts of AI are. I was at a thing at Cambridge a few months ago, and this professor who's with the Center for Existential Risk, which is now a new thing that actually is studying the likelihood of like the demise of human beings based off of technology. And you know, they said that we're Lucan sapiens. For 2,000 or 5,000, however many thousands of years, we've been Homo sapiens, descended from the hominid. But we're now, probably this generation, Lucan sapiens, the last universal common ancestor, because the technology changes that are happening are going to create augmentation, whether it's at the DNA level or at the mechanical kind of silicon level. So I'd love to just get a view from both of you about what are you most concerned about in terms of the, say, mid-range impacts of the technology that's coming out of the Valley? And how do you see that playing out?
Sure. So I think the concern for me is the privacy issue, which is, you know, companies, the governments have a tremendous amount of data. And, you know, if you start putting chips within yourself, so, you know, we have a chip in our dog so you can find your dog, right? Well, I don't think it's that far down the road that we're going to have you have the ability to put a chip in yourself, whether it's to monitor health events, whether it's so I don't lose my kid at a mall. I had a young kid who used to run around a lot and escape. So, and it's great things, but so, you know, I used to be a former federal prosecutor, and so I saw that aspect of the control, and I think the federal government generally does a good job with the things that it does, but the idea that everybody knows exactly where you're going to be, and that technology allows it. I mean, just with your iPhone, right? Everywhere you go, it pops up and says, you know, I hop in my car and it says 23 minutes till I get home. Like, how do they know I'm going home, right? But I guess it's because I hop in the car around the same time. So that to me is one of my bigger concerns, is that somebody, whether it is Google, and I think, you know, or Facebook or whomever, or it's the government, will know everything that I'm doing and everything I'm buying and what I'm going to, soon with artificial intelligence, what I'm going to buy next.
Yeah, and I would go back to my earlier point. I think, and taking the entrepreneur perspective, the idea that you can solve these problems or create these advantages or do different things is, I think the intention is generally like good. People think that they're making, but there's not much consideration of what the sort of darker application of that might be, or the downside. Because it's so culturally so forward-looking and positive about what's possible, I think that's a sort of optimistic view, but there's not necessarily the same maybe or appropriate attention paid to what are some of the other implications. I think you can see some of that in, you know, like we were talking about Uber and different, like, you know, if you have Airbnb, who pays the taxes for hotel tax, like those are relatively minor relative to existential threats. But I think that exists with this idea of like creation and innovation, and then think about it. And and it's already out of the box. So I think that's interesting.
Okay. So as we wrap up, I just have one last question for both of you. So a lot of people, whether they're watching on Facebook right now, hello to all of our Hub Culture friends, or via social, you know, a lot of us have to go to the Valley and work and, you know, have meetings and that sort of thing. So where's your favorite place to get coffee or to do that little coffee meeting? Like, you're booking it, you got to schedule 4 meetings in 6 hours. Where can you kind of hold court and, you know, be in the right place at the right time?
111 Minna. That's what I think.
Okay, that's in the city.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I really like Phil's and Pete's. Those are my 2 go-to places.
Okay, good. All right, guys, thanks so much for joining us here at GetGlobal. Thanks so much for everybody tuning into this. I'm Stan Stoliker with Hub Culture. We have more Facebook Live sessions coming over the next couple of days, and you can catch everything at hublive.tv. Thanks.